Do you think Russia could collapse? Putin could collapse? Do you think Russia could fragment?
Boy, I when I was in graduate school, and I'm going to answer this by being, as the late Senator Paul Tsongas would say, it's a very good question. Let me do my best to evade you. When I was in graduate school in the early 1980s, I remember one of my professors saying, the idea that the Soviet Union could collapse into its constituent republics is so absurd, we're not even going to discuss it. And that was in like early 1985.
The signs were on the wall at that point.
Yeah, well,
isn't it the writing was on the wall?
Listen, my academic field of Sovietology still, most of those guys have passed away, but they had a lot to answer for in terms of getting a lot of stuff wrong. That was a well-respected Soviet expert at Columbia University who said that to me. So I was pretty stunned. But again, what does it mean for Russia to collapse? Does it mean that Yakutia or other places declare independence and try to become an independent country? I don't actually think that happens, in part because it's in no one's interest, even for potentially breakaway parts of Russia, because the whole infrastructure, is organized like a spider web, that with the center being in Moscow. Now, with that said, could it go back to the way it was in the 1990s with a very weak center, and bilateral relations between Moscow and these regions? I guess. But I think it really depends on what happens after Putin, and who steps forward. The reason I told that story about my old professor is I don't want to be in the position of being one of those guys making one of those confident pronouncements, and then a year later you're going to say, Tom, come back on the show and explain that completely idiotic prediction. So I'm not going to make a prediction. I don't think so. I think there was more danger of that 30 years ago. But I think if this government collapses, part of Russia rejoining the global economy is it will need a national government of some kind. The only question is how weak or strong that would be. I mean, Russia in 1995 under Putin was a national government, under Yeltsin, but it was basically governed by Yeltsin making side deals. I mean, one of the things Putin, I'll end on this. There is still a kind of a debate among at least some Russia watchers about, was Putin always like this, or did he change? When you pointed out that when he comes back for a third term, he's a different guy. He's decided, that's it. I'm a mob boss. I have to die in office. I can't ever leave. Because some of the things he did in the early 2000s, they were actually reasonable things. Like he was a pro-Western, pro-Atlantic leader. He was fixing the Russian legal system. He was kind of shoring up some of these deals, with better legal arrangements than Yeltsin had. Could another Russian leader do that? Maybe, yeah. But I really don't want to prognosticate what happens if Putin goes down in the wake of a failed war. Garry Kasparov is right. The Russians forgive everything except a bad war. And if this war goes on like this and Putin loses and is somehow deposed, I just don't have a good sense of who steps in and what happens next. And I think anybody who says they do is probably making it up, because that's one of these contingent historical events that I don't think you can predict very well.
Well, you said evasive, but it was also quite a decisive response. I can actually say that I had the pleasure of meeting Kasparov a couple of weeks ago back in New York, and I've also been in touch with a colleague of his, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who'll be on the show. So a little cheeky float there for everyone watching.